Let's look at number 22. The conclusion follows logically if which of the following is assumed. So we need to look for a missing assumption in the argument. We want to find the gap between the support and the conclusion, and that's going to be the thing that's being assumed. So let's read the paragraph. It says, because of the ubiquity of television in modern households, not that many children today are spending their free time reading stories which lack the visual appeal of flashy TV programs. In other words, children aren't really spending their free time reading stories today because they're watching TV. Therefore, thus, here's the conclusion based off of that information, therefore, few children today are going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. So this is a very simple two-part argument. We have supporting evidence and then we have conclusion. And both the support and the evidence are about children today, right? The support is telling you a fact about children today, and the conclusion is therefore inferring another fact about children today. So the support is telling you that few children are spending their free time reading stories, and the conclusion is telling you that therefore few children today are going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. So as with any argument, every argument always assumes that the support proves the conclusion. That's the missing assumption. If support, then conclusion. This person making this argument is assuming that if support, what did we say the support was? If few children today are spending their free time reading stories, then what did we say the conclusion was? Few children today will develop a lifelong interest in literature. That and only that is the simple assumption of the argument. If support, then conclusion. We're assuming that if they're not spending their free time reading stories, then that means they're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Now, that's an assumption. Who says that that's true? That's not a given. That's something that this person's assuming. This person's assuming that you have to spend your free time reading stories if you're going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Again, you can argue against that assumption, Who says you have to spend your free time reading stories? Maybe you just spend your time in class. If you're a kid, you're reading literature as part of English class, and that's how you develop a lifelong interest in literature. Or maybe you develop it later on. You study literature in college or whatever. There's many other ways potentially that you could develop a lifelong interest in literature other than spending your free time reading stories as a child. But according to this argument, we're assuming that that's not the case. We're assuming if support, then conclusion. We're assuming if you don't spend your free time reading stories as a kid, then you're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. That is the missing assumption of this argument. So let's look for an answer that says that. Anything that says anything else will be wrong. A tells us that no children who do spend their free time reading stories fail to then develop a lifelong interest in literature. In other words, A is saying all children who do spend their free time reading stories do develop a lifelong interest in literature. Is that the assumption that we were looking for? The answer is no. It's kind of a reversal of what we were looking for. What we are looking for is to assume that children who don't spend their free time reading stories don't develop a lifelong interest in literature. That was the direction the argument was going in. The argument said children today are mostly not spending their free time reading stories, and therefore children today are mostly not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Right? So we're assuming if you don't spend your free time reading stories, you're not going to develop that interest. A is saying the children who do spend their free time reading stories are definitely going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. That's not the same thing. We know with conditional logic, you can never substitute if not X, then not Y with if yes X, then yes Y, right? Those two things don't mean the same thing, and that's the equivalent of, in this case, A and the assumption that we're looking for meaning the same thing, which they do not. Therefore, A is a reversal. It's not the correct answer. B says only those people who currently are spending their free time reading stories are going to then develop a lifelong interest in literature. In other words, B is saying that people who don't currently spend their free time reading stories are not going to develop that lifelong interest in literature. Is that the assumption we're looking for? The answer is yes. It should sound very familiar. This is exactly what we said the argument was assuming, right? The support of the argument was that the children today are not spending their free time reading stories. And the conclusion was, therefore, the children today are mostly not going to develop that lifelong interest in literature. We were assuming if support, then conclusion. If you don't spend your free time reading stories, then you're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. That's literally what B is saying. B is saying only those people who do spend their free time reading stories are going to develop that interest. In other words, that's another way of saying people who don't spend their free time reading stories are not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature, and therefore that's the missing assumption. If you assume that B is true, that proves the conclusion of the argument. The thus part of the argument is now proven. We now know beyond a reasonable doubt that few children today are going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. In other words, if you know the support is true, the first part of the paragraph, plus you add B in as an assumption, that's going to prove the conclusion of the argument. That's what you're looking for. Support plus assumption equals conclusion. And therefore, B is the correct answer. It does fill in the gap in the argument. C is saying that the missing assumption is that no children that grow up in a household that lacks a television fail to spend their free time reading stories. In other words, this is saying that children who grow up without a TV, according to C, those children always spend their free time reading stories. Is that the missing assumption we were looking for? The answer is no. It doesn't connect at all to our conclusion. Right? We already know from this paragraph that few children are spending their free time reading stories, and that's because they have televisions. But that's sort of neither here nor there. The point of the supporting evidence of the paragraph is that they don't spend their free time reading stories, and then the conclusion is to say that therefore they're definitely not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Why? Because they're not spending their free time reading stories. Now, C is saying, by the way, the children who grow up without a TV, they do spend their free time reading stories. Okay, good for them. But we already know that, according to the paragraph, most children today are not spending their free time reading stories, right? And so telling me about the minority that don't, let's say they don't have a TV in their household, that's what C is saying. If they don't have a TV in their household, they're definitely in that minority that, that do spend their free time reading stories. That's not going to change anything, right? And it's not going to help us get to our conclusion, because our conclusion is at the end of the day, whether they're spending their free time reading stories or not spending their free time reading stories, the question is, therefore, can we make this conclusion that few children today are going to develop a lifelong interest in literature? So the gap in the argument was between what you spend your free time on and therefore what you're going to or going to not develop a lifelong interest in. And C does not bridge that gap, right? And therefore C is not going to help us get to our conclusion. It has nothing to do with the conclusion. The conclusion is about whether children today will develop a lifelong interest in literature. Namely, the conclusion is saying that they will not, for the most part. And the support is because they're not spending their free time reading stories. C doesn't help you get from that support to that conclusion, so it's not the right answer. D is perhaps a little tricky. D says that few people who watch a great deal of television go on to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Is that telling us the assumption that we need to know? The assumption that we were looking for this paragraph, for this argument, was people who don't spend their free time reading stories don't develop a lifelong interest in literature, right? That's if support, then conclusion. Support was telling us that kids today don't spend their free time reading stories. Conclusion was therefore they're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. Is that what D is telling us? Not exactly. D is telling us people who watch a great deal of television mostly are not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. That's not exactly tying the support to the conclusion. Now, the paragraph did mention that it's because of the ubiquity of television that children don't spend their free time reading stories. But that was neither here nor there. That was just a by-the-way reason. If you're curious why few children today are spending their free time reading stories, it's because the ubiquity of television. But the point of the first sentence of the paragraph given was that at the end of the day, whether it's because of television or it's because of whatever other reason, because they're sports or hobbies or whatever, at the end of the day, the point of that sentence is that they're not spending their free time reading stories. And we're inferring from that therefore they're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature, right? So the TV was not a central part of this argument. And D does not help us prove this conclusion because D introduces this quantity, great deal of television. I don't know if these children in the paragraph are watching, quote unquote, a great deal of television. All it says is that because they have a TV, because of the ubiquity of television, they are not spending their free time reading stories. Now, I don't know if that means they're watching a great deal of television. Maybe they only have half an hour a day of free time, and instead of reading stories, they are watching television in that 30 minutes. Maybe that's not a great deal of television. So maybe D is talking about people that have nothing to do with this paragraph. Maybe D is talking about people who are not these children. Maybe D is talking about people who are graduated from school and now they have way more free time and they're spending 4 to 5 hours a day watching television, or they're on summer vacation or whatever, great deal of television. That doesn't necessarily apply to this paragraph. So that's a new sort of quantifier, great deal of television. And D is just telling us that people who watch a great deal of television tend to mostly not develop a lifelong interest in literature, but that doesn't help us with our argument. The argument never told us that these children spend a great deal of time watching television, or watch a great deal of television was the exact words that D used. The paragraph never told us that that's true of these kids. It just says that they're not spending their free time reading stories. Why? Because of the ubiquity of television. Now, is that because they're watching a great deal of television? Or maybe they're just watching a little bit of television with the amount of free time that they have? That we don't know. And that's why D is not going to help us get to our conclusion. But again, the very simple reason that I pointed out at the beginning of this explanation was that D is simply not tying our support to our conclusion in the simplest way possible, right? At the end of the day, the upshot of the support of the paragraph was that they're not spending their free time reading stories. That's what we need to look to tie that to the conclusion, which is that therefore they're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature, and D doesn't do that. E is telling us that few children who do spend their free time reading stories watch television. In other words, E tells you it's kind of one or the other. Either you're going to spend your free time reading stories or watching television, but you're not going to do both, right? If you spend your free time reading stories, then you're probably not going to be the type of child that watches television. Is that going to help us get to our conclusion? Is that the assumption we were looking for? The conclusion that we need to prove is that since they're not reading stories, they're not going to develop a lifelong interest in literature. That's the gap we have to fill. E has nothing to do with this conclusion, though. E has nothing to do with whether they're going to develop a lifelong interest in literature or not. E just tells us if they're spending their free time reading stories, they're not watching television, which is another way of saying if they're watching television, they're probably not spending their free time reading stories. Okay, fine, but at the end of the day, are they going to develop that lifelong interest in literature or are they not? In other words, is the conclusion true or false? E doesn't tell us anything about the conclusion, therefore it cannot be the missing assumption. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.